The road to the cabin was narrow, flanked by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Nathan, a city dweller by heart, had always scoffed at the idea of a peaceful retreat in the wilderness. Yet here he was, driving through the remote forest, away from the noise and chaos of his everyday life, with only the promise of solitude to keep him company. It wasn't his idea, though. His sister, Emily, had insisted he take a break. "You're always working," she said. "Go recharge, find some peace." She'd rented a cabin for him in the heart of the forest, a secluded spot where cell service was non-existent, and nature reigned supreme. At first, Nathan resisted, but the thought of escaping for a few days without emails and phone calls became tempting enough. As the cabin came into view, Nathan couldn't help but appreciate its charm. Nestled among the trees, it was small but cozy, with a rustic wooden exterior that blended seamlessly with the forest around it. He parked his car, grabbed his bags, and headed inside. The interior of the cabin was simple. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bed in the corner. It was clean and well maintained, though it had an eerie silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Nathan shrugged off the feeling, chalking it up to his city boy nerves. After unpacking, he decided to explore the area. He grabbed the map left for him on the counter and set off into the forest. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine needles filled his lungs. For the first time in years, Nathan felt a sense of calm wash over him. The forest was beautiful, serene even. Birds chirped above, and the rustle of leaves underfoot was soothing. But as he ventured deeper, that sense of calm began to wane. The trees grew denser, their shadows longer, and the chirping of birds ceased. It wasn't gradual but sudden, as if the forest had collectively held its breath. Nathan stopped in his tracks, straining to hear something, anything. There was nothing, just the oppressive silence that pressed in from all sides. A chill ran down his spine. He glanced at his map, realizing he had wandered farther than he intended. The path back to the cabin was unclear now, with the overgrowth of bushes and trees making it difficult to discern. Nathan cursed under his breath and turned back, retracing his steps. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Nathan quickened his pace, his heart rate rising. The forest, once peaceful, now felt suffocating, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made him jump. It was as if something was watching him, lurking just out of sight, hidden in the shadows between the trees. He tried to reassure himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. But the deeper he walked into the forest, the stronger the sensation became, eyes following him, hidden in the gloom. Sweat trickled down the back of his neck as his footsteps echoed louder than they should. There was no denying it now. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, he heard a whisper, faint but distinct. It wasn't the wind, nor the sound of the trees creaking. It was a voice, soft and eerie, like someone calling his name from a distance. Nathan, his breath caught in his throat. He spun around, scanning the darkening woods for any sign of life. Nothing. The voice came again, closer this time. Nathan, panic surged through him, and he broke into a run, blindly sprinting toward what he hoped was the direction of the cabin. His feet pounded the earth, twigs snapping beneath him as the trees whipped past. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him, coming from every direction. Nathan, it was relentless, as though the forest itself had come alive, calling out to him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. His lungs burned, and his legs ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to make it back to the cabin, to safety. After what felt like hours of running, he finally burst through the trees and into the clearing where the cabin stood. Gasping for breath, he stumbled up the steps and threw open the door, slamming it shut behind him. His heart raced, and his mind swirled with questions. What the hell was that? Who or what had been calling his name? He bolted the door and collapsed onto the bed, his body trembling from adrenaline. The silence inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the madness outside. For a moment, he thought he was safe. But then, the whispering started again. Nathan, it was inside. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the voice. The cabin was small, with nowhere to hide. Yet the voice was unmistakable, closer now, almost in his ear. Nathan, he backed into a corner, clutching a nearby fire poker like a lifeline, his knuckles white with fear. His eyes scanned every inch of the room, expecting something, anything, to appear. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Nathan's pulse thundered in his ears as he stood frozen, waiting. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Slowly, he began to relax, convincing himself that maybe, just maybe, it was all in his head. But then, a shadow shifted near the window. He stared at it, heart pounding, as the shadow slowly took form. It wasn't just a trick of the light. There was something, someone, standing outside the cabin, watching him. The figure was tall, with unnaturally long limbs, its face obscured by darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at him through the glass. Nathan's breath hitched. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was as though the forest had sent something after him, something that wasn't entirely human. Suddenly, the window shattered. The figure lunged forward, its elongated arms reaching for him. Nathan swung the fire poker wildly, but the figure was too fast. It knocked the weapon from his hand and grabbed him, its grip cold and unyielding. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. The last thing Nathan saw before everything went black was the figure's face, pale, featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to consume everything around them. When Nathan's sister, Emily, arrived at the cabin 2 days later, she found it abandoned. The front door was wide open, the windows broken, and Nathan's belongings scattered across the floor. There was no sign of her brother, no clue as to where he had gone. The only thing left behind was a single message, scrawled in dirt on the floor near the window. "Come find me, Emily never did." I never used to be afraid of thunderstorms. In fact, I used to find them peaceful. The rhythmic sound of rain on the roof, the occasional crack of thunder, the brief flash of lightning illuminating the sky. It was almost hypnotic. That was before I took the job as a watchtower guard in the middle of nowhere. Now, I know better. I had been working as a security guard for a few years before I got assigned to the watchtower. It was supposed to be an easy gig, sit in a tower, keep an eye out for fires, wildlife disturbances, and anything unusual in the forest below. The real appeal was the solitude. I didn't have to deal with people, and that was a blessing after years of working in noisy city environments. I thought it would be peaceful. I thought wrong. The first few weeks went by uneventfully. I'd spend my shifts watching the forest, occasionally spotting a deer or some hikers in the distance. It was almost boring. The only real excitement came from the storms that would roll in unexpectedly. Thunderstorms were common in this area, especially during the summer, but they were usually mild. I'd sit in the tower, watching the lightning light up the sky and listening to the rain drum against the windows. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late August, just before the end of my shift. The sky had been clear all day, but as the sun set, dark clouds started to gather on the horizon. I didn't think much of it at first. Thunderstorms usually passed quickly, and I figured this one would be no different. But as the clouds rolled in, something felt off. The wind picked up, howling through the trees below like a distant scream. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone. The sky, once a deep indigo, turned an unsettling shade of green. I had never seen a storm like this before. It was unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. I radioed the station to let them know a storm was coming. They told me to ride it out and that they'd check in after it passed. Standard procedure. I wasn't worried, at least not yet. As the first drops of rain splattered against the tower, I settled into my chair, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind rattled the windows as though trying to break in. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing minute. I tried to focus on my duties, scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble, but the storm demanded my attention. Lightning lit up the sky, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that made my heart skip a beat. It was getting worse, and fast. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. "Watchtower 3, do you copy? Over." I grabbed the receiver, a little too eagerly. "This is Watchtower 3. What's going on?" "We're getting reports of power outages across the region," the voice crackled through the static. "Be advised, the storm is intensifying. If you see anything unusual, report it immediately." "Over." "Copy that," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing unease gnawing at me. I set the radio down and resumed my watch, my eyes scanning the dark forest below. For a while, nothing happened, just rain, wind, and the occasional flash of lightning. But as I squinted, I saw it more clearly. Something, or someone, was moving through the forest. At first, it looked like a person, stumbling through the underbrush, their silhouette barely visible between the trees. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the figure. That's when I saw it more clearly, and my stomach twisted in fear. It was a man, but something was wrong with him. He was pale to pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were torn, hanging off his thin frame, and his eyes were wide and blinking, staring straight ahead as he walked in a jerky, unnatural way. I reached for the radio, my hand trembling. "Watchtower 3 to base, come in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is base." "Go ahead, Watchtower 3. There's someone out in the forest," I stammered. "About a mile out, heading north. They don't look right." "Copy that, Watchtower 3. We'll send someone to check it out. Stay in position and keep an eye on them." Over. I set the radio down and turned back to the window, my heart racing. The figure was still there, moving closer now, though it didn't seem to notice the tower. I watched as it stumbled through the trees, its movement stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being jerked around by invisible strings. The storm raged on, lightning flashing intermittently, casting the forest in an eerie, strobe-like light. Each flash illuminated the figure for just a moment, and each time, it was closer. And then, in the midst of the storm's fury, the man stopped. He was standing at the edge of a clearing, directly below the watchtower now. I could see him clearly through the rain, his gaunt face, his hollow eyes staring up at me. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring. A chill ran down my spine as our eyes met, though I couldn't be sure he was actually seeing me. His gaze was blank, distant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. For what felt like an eternity, we stood like that, me in the safety of the watchtower, and him down below, and moving, and blinking. The only sound was the storm raging around us, wind howling, rain lashing against the windows, and the distant boom of thunder. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. "Watchtower 3, do you copy?" "Over." I jumped, fumbling for the receiver. "Watchtower 3 here. We're getting conflicting reports about the storm. It's moving erratically. Be advised, you may experience some interference." "Over. Understood," I replied, glancing back out the window. The man was still there, his eyes locked on the tower. The radio crackled again, but this time, the voice on the other end was distorted, gobbled by static. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded wrong, like something was mimicking the dispatcher's voice. I dropped the receiver, my heart hammering in my chest. The power went out. The watchtower plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning outside. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the flashlight in my bag. I flicked it on and aimed it out the window. The man was gone. My pulse raced as I scanned the clearing below. He had vanished, as if he'd never been there at all. I shined the light into the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the relentless storm and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I reached for the radio again, my hand shaking. "Base, come in." There was a man outside the tower, but he's gone now. "Do you copy?" No response. "Base, do you copy?" The static on the other end of the line was deafening, but there was no voice. I was on my own. For the next few hours, I stayed glued to the window, flashlight in hand, watching the forest below. The storm raged on, and with every flash of lightning, I expected to see that figure again, standing in the clearing, watching me, but he never returned. When the storm finally passed, and the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Exhausted, I slumped into my chair, the events of the night playing over and over in my mind. The radio crackled to life again, startling me. "Watchtower 3, this is Base. Do you copy?" I grabbed the receiver. "I copy. What happened last night?" There was a pause on the other end, and when the dispatcher spoke again, his voice was grim. "We lost contact with you for several hours. The storm knocked out the power to most of the region. Did you experience any issues?" "Yeah," I said, swallowing hard. "There was a man outside the tower. He disappeared when the power went out." "Did the search team find anything?" Another long pause. "Search team. We didn't send anyone out last night." My blood ran cold. "But you told me." "We didn't send anyone. Watchtower 3. No one should have been out there." The line went dead. I never saw the figure again after that night. But every time a storm rolls in, I find myself watching the forest more closely, waiting for the man with hollow eyes to return. I never used to be afraid of thunderstorms. Now I dread them. The job as a security guard wasn't supposed to be like this. Most of the time, my shifts consisted of long stretches of boredom, just me sitting in the basement office of a high-rise tower, watching grainy security camera footage of empty hallways and shadowy parking lots. It was monotonous work, but it paid the bills, and that was all I needed. That was until one night when everything changed. I was working the graveyard shift, alone as usual. It was an uneventful Friday evening, the kind where most of the city seemed to be sleeping, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and the low buzz of the monitors to keep me company. My office was in the basement of the building, deep below ground level, a windowless room that always felt a little too cold and a little too quiet. The isolation didn't bother me much, at least not till that night. I had been on duty for a few hours when I noticed something strange on one of the monitors. The camera feed for the basement storage area, one of the least used parts of the building, was flickering. At first, I thought it was just a technical glitch, but then I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the screen. I leaned closer, squinting at the monitor, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow was faint, barely visible in the dim light of the storage area, but it was definitely moving. It looked like a person, but there was something off about the way they moved, slow, jerky, almost like they were dragging themselves through the room. My first instinct was to radio the night manager and let him know what I was seeing, but then I remembered something. The basement storage area was supposed to be locked. No one was allowed down there after hours, not even staff. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, slipping out of the office and heading toward the elevator. The descent to the basement was unsettling. The elevator creaked and groaned as it made its way down, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse quickening as I thought about what I had seen on the monitor. Maybe it was just a homeless person who had found their way inside. Or maybe it was a prank. I tried to reassure myself as the elevator doors slid open, revealing the dimly lit hallway that led to the storage area. The air down here felt different, heavier, colder. The hum of the building's ventilation system was louder, reverberating off the concrete walls. I walked down the narrow corridor, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door to the storage area was just ahead. When I reached it, I hesitated. The door was locked, just as it should have been. But that didn't explain the shadow I had seen on the monitor. My heart pounded in my chest as I unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping into the storage room. The room was vast, filled with rows of metal shelves, all of them cluttered with old files, broken office equipment, and forgotten supplies. The air was musty, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the floor. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, or maybe it was just a glitch in the camera feed after. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the concrete floor. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was coming from deeper within the storage area, somewhere in the back where the shelves were stacked higher and the light didn't reach. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and slowly made my way toward the source of the noise. The deeper I went, the darker it got. The flashlight beam seemed weaker, the shadows longer and more menacing. The scraping sound grew louder, more distinct, like metal against concrete. My heart raced as I turned the corner, stepping into the farthest section of the room. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched in the shadows, hunched over something I couldn't see. It looked human, but there was something wrong with the way it moved, its limbs too long, its joints twisted at unnatural angles. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the figure was dragging something behind it, something heavy and wet. I took a step back, my breath hitching in my throat. The figure stopped moving, its head snapping up to face me. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were wide, hollow pits of darkness, devoid of any emotion or recognition. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then it let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I sprinted back toward the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. Behind me, I could hear the scraping sound again, faster now. Like whatever that thing was, it was chasing me. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the keys. For a moment, I just stood there, leaning against the door, trying to catch my breath. The hallway was silent, the only sound the pounding of my heart in my ears. I fumbled for my radio, my voice shaky as I called the night manager. "Base, this is Watchtower 3, I stammered. "There's something in the basement storage area. I don't know what it is, but it's not human. You need to send someone down here." There was a long pause on the other end, the static crackling ominously. "Watchtower 3, this is Base," the manager's voice finally replied, but something about it sounded off, distorted, like it was coming from far away. "Stay where you are. Do not go back into the storage area. We'll send help." The radio went silent again, and I stared at it, my mind racing. Something was very wrong. The voice on the other end didn't sound like the night manager. It didn't even sound human. I needed to get out of there. I bolted back to the elevator, my flashlight flickering weakly as I ran. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened. The power had gone out. I cursed under my breath, my mind scrambling for a solution. The only other way out was the stairwell, but that meant going through the dark, narrow hallway where I had first entered the basement. With no other choice, I turned and headed for the stairwell door. The hallway stretched out before me, long and dimly lit by the emergency lights. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as I made my way down the corridor, my eyes darting nervously from side to side. I reached the stairwell door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. But just as I was about to open it, I heard something behind me, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. "Come back." The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. At the far end of the hallway, standing just outside the storage room door, was the figure. It hadn't followed me. It was just standing there, watching. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Come back." I didn't wait to hear it a third time. I yanked open the stairwell door and sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop until I reached the ground floor. I burst through the door into the lobby, gasping for air, and slammed it shut behind me. The lobby was empty, the only sound the hum of the emergency lights overhead. I collapsed into one of the chairs, my heart still racing, trying to process what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. I stayed there for the rest of my shift, too afraid to go back down to the basement. When the morning shift arrived, I handed in my resignation without explanation. I never went back to that building. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that whisper, "Come back." I never believed in the supernatural, much less in the existence of werewolves. The idea of man turning into a bloodthirsty beast under the light of the full moon was something I considered absurd. But that belief was shattered one fateful night, a night I still struggle to wrap my head around. It wasn't a nightmare or a figment of my imagination. This was real. My name is Paul Mason, and I work as a wildlife researcher. My job often takes me to remote places, tracking animal migration patterns and studying their behaviors. On this particular assignment, I was stationed in a dense forest on the outskirts of a small town called Millersville. The forest, known as Darkwood, was an untouched wilderness, a sanctuary for wildlife. It was also steeped in local legends, the kind that I usually found amusing, stories of ghosts, witches, and creatures that roam the woods at night. I arrived at the forest a few days before the incident. My task was to study the behavior of a pack of wolves that had been sighted in the area. Wolves were rare in this part of the state, so it was a unique opportunity for me. I had set up camp in a small clearing deep in the woods, far from any human settlement. My equipment was basic but efficient: trail cameras, tracking devices, and a small tent to sleep in. The days passed uneventfully. I would spend my mornings hiking through the forest, looking for signs of the wolves, tracks, droppings, or any evidence of their presence. By evening, I would return to camp, review the footage from the trail cameras, and make notes on my findings. It was peaceful, almost serene, and I felt completely at ease in the solitude of the forest. That changed on the fourth night. The day had been like any other. I spent hours following a set of fresh tracks, but they led me deeper into the forest than I had intended to go. By the time I realized how far I had ventured, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to head back to camp before it got dark, so I hurriedly retraced my steps. As I walked, a strange feeling crept over me, a sense of being watched. I stopped several times, scanning the woods around me, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of my mind. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the safety of my camp. The forest was almost pitch black by the time I arrived. The moon, full and bright, hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. I went about my usual routine, reviewing the day's footage and jotting down my observations. But that nagging feeling of being watched hadn't left me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. I decided to call it a night early. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and lay down, trying to push the unease from my mind. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the wind rustling the trees, usually lulled me to sleep, but tonight they only heightened my anxiety. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard something, a low, guttural growl. My eyes snapped open, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl wasn't far away. It sounded like it was just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening intently, my mind racing. Could it be a bear, or maybe one of the wolves I had been tracking? But something about the growl didn't seem right. It was too deep, too menacing, almost like a warning. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, and zipping the flap of the tent as quietly as I could. The growl came again, closer this time. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the flashlight, shining the beam into the darkness outside. At first, I saw nothing. The light cut through the trees, illuminating only shadows. But then, as I swept the beam to the right, I saw it. Standing just a few feet away from my tent was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and thick, muscular limbs. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed a sickly yellow in the beam of my flashlight. But what struck me the most was its face, a grotesque mix of man and wolf, with a long snout, sharp fangs, and pointed ears. It was hunched over slightly, its claws digging into the ground as it snarled at me. For a moment, I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. Werewolves didn't exist. But the creature in front of me was very real. It took a step toward me, its lips curling back to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. My instincts kicked in, and I scrambled backward, dropping the flashlight in my panic. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing, its growls growing louder as it closed in on me. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack, still half-packed, and bolted out of the tent, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I sprinted through the trees. The sound of the creature's footsteps, heavy and deliberate, followed close behind. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face and arms as I tore through the undergrowth. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear it, pounding footsteps, the snapping of twigs, and that low, guttural growl. It was toying with me. I realized that with a sickening jolt of fear. It could have caught me by now if it wanted to, but it didn't. It was hunting me. I stumbled over a tree root, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't have time to think about it. I pushed myself up, limping forward as fast as I could. My only hope was to find some kind of shelter, somewhere I could hide until daylight. That's when I saw it, a cabin, barely visible through the trees, its windows dark and shuttered. I didn't care who or what was inside. I just needed to get there. I hobbled toward the cabin, the creature still behind me, its growls growing louder and more aggressive. I reached the door and threw myself against it, pounding on the wood with my fists. "Help, please, let me in." I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear. There was no answer. I tried the door handle. It was locked. I banged on the door again, desperation clawing at my chest. Just as I was about to give up, the door creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and without a word, he stepped aside, letting me in. I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with trembling hands. The old man stood in the corner of the room, watching me silently. His hands were shaking, and his breathing was ragged. "You saw it, didn't you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "What is it?" The old man shook his head slowly. "The beast of Darkwood. It's been hunting these woods for as long as I can remember. You're lucky to be alive." I glanced out the window, my heart still pounding. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but I knew it was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The old man lit a lantern, casting a dim light across the room. The cabin was small and cramped, with only a single bed and a few pieces of old furniture. There were scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. "Does it come here often?" I asked, my voice shaky. The old man nodded. "Every full moon. It's always hungry, always hunting. You are lucky to find this place, but it won't stop. Not until it gets what it wants." I shuddered, sinking into a chair by the window. Outside, The forest was eerily silent, as if every living thing had gone into hiding. Hours passed in tense silence. The old man and I barely spoke, both of us listening for any sign of the creature's return. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but there was no sign of the beast. Just as dawn was breaking, I finally allowed myself to relax. The old man was dozing in his chair, and I was struggling to keep my eyes open. Maybe the creature had given up, or maybe it had found another prey. But then I heard it, a soft scratching at the door. I tensed, my heart skipping a beat. The old man's eyes snapped open, and he shot me a terrified look. "It's here," he whispered. We both stood frozen, listening to the scratching. It was slow and deliberate, like whatever was outside was testing the door, trying to find a way in. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a deafening crash, the door was ripped from its hinges. The creature stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the rising sun. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it let out a roar that shook the walls of the cabin. There was no escape. The last thing I remember is the old man screaming as the beast lunged at us, its claws outstretched. Then everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying in the forest. The cabin was gone, and so was the old man. I was alone, with no memory of how I had escaped. But I knew one thing for certain. The beast of Darkwood was real, and it was still out there. Forests always had a way of making me feel alive, even after all the stories I had heard growing up. Briarwood Forest, especially, was a place of legend, a secluded expanse of dense trees and fog, laden paths just outside my hometown of Redwood Creek. Locals claimed it was haunted, but as far as I was concerned, it was just another patch of wilderness where I could escape the humdrum of my 9-to-5 life. The weekend camping trip had been planned for weeks. I was heading out with two of my closest friends, Matt and Sarah, both of whom were as enthusiastic about the outdoors as I was. We'd done similar trips before, but this time, the thrill was heightened by the mystery surrounding Briarwood. Everyone in town said it was a place you didn't want to be after dark, but we weren't the superstitious type. Ghost stories were for campfires and Netflix marathons, not for rational adults like us. We packed our gear and set off on a sunny Friday afternoon, the weight of our backpacks only making us more excited for the adventure ahead. The plan was to hike deep into Briarwood, set up camp by an old stream Sarah had heard about, and spend the weekend disconnecting from the world. No phones, no work, just nature and good company. As we entered the forest, the thick canopy overhead blocked out most of the sunlight, casting the ground in shadows. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that instantly made you feel far removed from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. The deeper we went, the quieter the world became, until all we could hear was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. "This is perfect," Sarah said, glancing around with a satisfied smile. "I can't believe we've never been out here before." "Probably because everyone says it's cursed," Matt joked, but his tone lacked any real conviction. He wasn't the kind to believe in such things, and neither was I. "People will say anything to keep others out of their favorite spots," I added. "Bet we'll have the whole place to ourselves." We continued hiking for a few more hours, the sun slowly dipping lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. Eventually, We found the stream Sarah had mentioned, a narrow ribbon of water that wound its way through the trees. The area was perfect for setting up camp, with plenty of flat ground and enough space for our tents. We quickly got to work, pitching our tents and gathering wood for a fire. By the time the sun had set, the fire was crackling, casting flickering light on our faces as we sat around it, passing around a bottle of whiskey and swapping stories. The forest had grown eerily silent, the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves replaced by an unsettling stillness. "You guys hear that?" Matt asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, glancing around. "Exactly. There's nothing. No animals, no wind. It's weird." I hadn't noticed it until he pointed it out, but he was right. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if all life had been sucked out of it. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional pop from the wood. "It's just the forest settling down for the night," I said, trying to brush off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. "Happens all the time." Matt didn't look convinced, but he shrugged and took another sip of whiskey. "Yeah, you're probably right." We continued talking, but the silence of the forest weighed heavy on us, making every snap of a twig or crack of a branch seem louder than it should have been. After a while, we decided to turn in for the night, each retreating to our tents. There was no escape. The last thing I remember is the old man screaming as the beast lunged at us, its claws outstretched. Then everything went black. I woke up hours later, lying in the forest. The cabin was gone, and so was the old man. I was alone, with no memory of how I had escaped. But I knew one thing for certain. The beast of Darkwood was real, and it was still out there. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring up at the dark canvas of my tent, listening for any sound that might break the oppressive silence. But there was nothing. No animals, no wind, just the faint sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of the fabric as I shifted. My mind began to wander, replaying the stories I'd heard about Briarwood. Tales of people going missing, of strange figures seen in the trees, of whispers carried on the wind that seemed to follow you wherever you went. I told myself it was all nonsense, just local folklore meant to scare kids and keep people from venturing too far into the woods. But then, I heard it, a voice. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was coming from outside the tent, from the trees beyond our campsite. The voice was low and indistinct, but it was definitely there, a soft whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, my heart racing as I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe Matt or Sarah talking in their sleep. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, as if it was calling to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Something was trying to lure me out. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow across the campsite. Everything looked normal, but the whispering continued, now coming from multiple directions, as if the forest itself was speaking. I crawled out of the tent, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the dark woods. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could be making the noise. "Matt, Sarah," I whispered, but there was no response. The whispering grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. Just the dark forest and the oppressive silence. I quickly retreated back into my tent. my hands shaking as I zipped it up. I lay there for the rest of the night, wide awake, listening to the whispers that seemed to circle our campsite, always just out of sight, always just beyond the trees. By morning, the whispers had stopped, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest waking up. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the stream babbled peacefully nearby, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I wasn't the only one who heard it. "Did you guys hear that last night?" Matt asked as we gathered around the fire for breakfast. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," Sarah said quietly. "I thought I was dreaming at first, but it was real," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It wasn't just the wind. There was something out there." We packed up our camp in record time, none of us wanting to spend another night in Briarwood. As we hiked back to the trailhead, the sense of unease never left us. The forest felt different, darker, as if it was watching us, waiting for us to leave. By the time we reached the car, none of us spoke. We piled in and drove away in silence, leaving Briarwood and its haunting whispers behind. But even now, weeks later, I can still hear them in my dreams, calling to me, luring me back to the forest. I'll never go back, but I can't escape the feeling that Briarwood isn't done with me yet. It's waiting, watching, and one day, I'm afraid it will call me back for good.